I'm very happy to be here. Packed house, a great venue, and a lot of people who want to hear about, I think, a very, very important topic, the ethics of artificial intelligence, and with a special focus today, what developers actually should know. So my name is Madai. I'm originally from Hungary. I grew up in Germany, so that's why I have this nice German accent. I have a background in medicine, neuroscience, ethics, and data science and AI. I'm a senior medical eye researcher at Charité, which is the largest medical university in Europe. And I'm CSO of AI for Medicine. And in both, we actually apply machine learning methods for the treatment and the prevention of stroke. And of course, during this work, a lot of also ethical topics came up. And since then, it's one of the topics that I talk about. I will briefly do a rundown of AI, which will be, especially given the crowd today, very brief. I will introduce what actually morality and ethics are, and then we're going to talk actually about the ethics of artificial intelligence. So this is a machine learning conference, so basically what I say now will be very brief. There might be a few people here to whom this is new. As you all know, or most of you know, AI is the field that is trying to develop intelligent agents. Intelligent agents here meaning it's a very, very narrow definition, tools that can do what humans could do so far only, or maybe even are better at them. Subfield of this is machine learning, where we use algorithms which actually can be used for many, many tasks, very importantly, given the data that I feed and the task that I want them to do. And the subfield again of this is deep learning, where we use deep artificial neural nets for this task. Now, as you know, and this later we will touch upon this again, AI is the buzzword. Everybody is doing AI nowadays. And what you usually mean when they say AI, they usually mean machine learning or specifically sometimes even only deep learning. But why is it such a hype? As you all know, these tools are actually powerful. They actually can do something. Self-driving cars, self-flying drones. Most of you probably talk to your phones and sometimes you get reasonable answers, recommendation systems, computer vision, and actually, as I learned yesterday, very, very big advances in the last year also in NLP. You should not miss the keynote of Malte Peach. He's going to have a really cool talk about that. You all know Andrew Ng, and he said famously, AI is the new electricity. And for a long time, I absolutely didn't like this sentence until I realized one thing, one analogy that I really like. Electricity, it's really around us. We don't see it, we just take it as granted, we just push a button, it's there. It's ubiquitous, and we don't think a lot about it. And as we can see, this is really one of the problems, how these systems will creep into our lives, and we will touch upon this later, why this is very important regarding the ethics of AI. But first, let's do a recap. What is actually morality and ethics? Morality is basically what you believe is right or wrong, what is good or bad behavior. This is what you personally believe, and although this is personal, we generally like to believe that this should be generally applicable. We do like if, we like other people who share our values. What could this be? I put here a few where we probably could all agree. Tell the truth, keep your promises, treat others as you want to be treated, be trustworthy. But of course, this is also about more abstract topics. All of you have an opinion, if it's okay or not, about abortion, animal testing, meat consumption, or human cloning. How do we get now from morality to ethics? Let's imagine a very, very simple conversation. He says, I'm against animal testing, I think it's immoral. And she will ask a very simple question. She will ask, why? So the moment we have to analyze, systematize, question morality, then we have reached ethics, because we have to find frameworks with which we can decide which morality is the best in a given situation, which one is justified. And this is what the field of ethics, part of philosophy, does. Let's look at an example. There's an ethical framework which is called utilitarianism. Very briefly, it says the most moral choice is always the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Let's look at an example. Some of you might be familiar with this. This has been a thought experiment in philosophy for a very long while. This is the so-called trolley problem. It's a very sadistic problem because somebody tied 5 people to a track, actually in total 6, 5 people to a track, and the trolley will inevitably take the straight way and kill 5 people. You are the person at the lever. You can change the lever, then the trolley will be diverted and it will kill only 1 person. According to utilitarianism, the most moral choice is clear. You have to push the lever because 1 person dying is better than 5 people dying. Other frameworks might decide differently. This was just an example, but we will see how this old thought experiment actually has a modern analogy in our new modern world. And with this, we come to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Why is this important? As we just saw, AI will lead to autonomous decision-making instead of humans. This is AI agency, and it's already starting to be around us. And a very, very good example here that we can look at is the example of self-driving cars. So imagine this car is on the road, and suddenly, due to whatever reason, there are many people on this road. Now, the car can measure everything. It can measure the distance, it knows how long the braking distance will be, and it could realize, I will run into these 10 people. But there's another choice. The car can also divert to the sidewalk. Problem is, there is 1 person on the sidewalk. So what should the car do? Should the car go straight, kill potentially many people, or should it divert to the sidewalk, potentially killing less? What is better? You can also imagine this was A, you can also imagine other scenarios. In B, that might be an easier because there might even be more passengers in the car, but it's a similar scenario. There's a person on the road. The car could divert, but now there's a wall. So now you as the driver / passenger are the one that is actually here in danger. Now you could say, okay, it's one-on-one, so of course then hit the person on the road. But what again if there are many people on the road? You're alone, there are 10 people on the road. So, this is actually a point, and I hope it's going to work, because yesterday it didn't, where I'm going to ask you a few questions. So take out your smartphones, please, and go to www.menti.com. I already have, it seems that I have to do it like this. Now you can't see it, right? Give me a second. Okay, now you should see it. Okay, great. So, you should go to www.menti.com and use the code, which you can see there, and then you should see that question, I hope, which is an autonomous car should save as many lives as possible or protect the driver or the passengers. It's still filling up quickly, so we wait a bit. Seems people are motivated. They see that, so many people have voted, so they vote themselves. But we're kind of reaching slowly a plateau, right? So we have a slight tendency in the audience towards utilitarianism, save as many lives as possible. Okay, this is the next question I'm going to ask you, and be honest, would you buy a car that would potentially kill you to save other people? Hey, where are all the utilitarianists? They left the premises. So I gave a similar talk yesterday at the Human Tech meeting, and it was similar results. And I have to say, this high number of no's is really so far exclusive to Poland. So it seems there aren't many utilitarianists generally here. 80% yesterday said no, so it's around 60 in other places. But the tendency is the same. I hope it will now switch back immediately. So I just give you another example. This was another place where I asked this. This was actually in Berlin. It was 70-30 in the first round, and then it switched to 60%. So as you can see, it is very, very simple to say something abstractly, but then the morality or idea might change very quickly when actually realize, hey, that also affects myself. And I didn't come up with these questions. This was actually a publication in Science in 2016, The Social Dilemma of Autonomous Vehicles, where exactly this was shown. And since then, I have replicated this in every talk where I ask this. It's, again, people are generally in favor of it, but no, not if it's about me. And this is really a problem, because if there's AI agency around us, we need to decide what morality this AI should have. And obviously, we're not even sure ourselves what that actually could be, because within 20 seconds you answered the question differently. So which morality should these tools actually have? We don't know, and I don't want to touch about it long, but just want to mention, of course, this is tied to all the questions of who is responsible if something wrong, with transparency, do you actually even know about these decisions and all these problems? I'm going to give now several more examples of ethical challenges of artificial intelligence. I want to start, and I touched upon this when I said AI is a buzzword. What is AI exactly? It's not defined. So how do you want to actually regulate something that is not defined? You make a law about something, and you write, we regulate artificial intelligence, and somebody says, yeah, but this isn't even AI, what I'm doing. So if it's ill-defined, you cannot even regulate it or make an ethical framework about it. This is a real problem. If you look at regulatory frameworks, each one tries to come up with their own definition, sometimes broad. So this already in itself is an ethical problem. A really big ethical problem, and I want to talk about this the longest from the ethical problems, is AI bias. As you probably all know, what is AI bias? It's a systematic deviation of what a system actually should do. Systematic deviation in the output. Let's look at a few examples. So this was an actual tool from Google that you could use to label your photos. It was good in labeling skyscrapers, airplanes, cars, bikes. Ouch. You should probably not label black people as gorillas. This was not a good tool, and Google had to take that, of course, offline. Let's look at another example. This is the Turkish language, which is regarding this thing that I want to tell you about, very similar to the Hungarian language. You have this sentence which was translated by Google Translate to "he is a doctor." You might ask yourself, what is the problem? The problem is that these first two words, which indicate this, are not specific. It's like in Hungarian. It can mean he, she, or it. And if you put in another sentence to translate, suddenly it's translated to "she is a nurse." So the translating tool somehow learned this bias that the moment it's about a doctor, of course, that person must be male. And if it's about a nurse, that person must be female. Now, of course, this is another bias, and Google actually fixed this. So if you do it now, you get the right translation that it could mean she's a doctor or he's a doctor. As Hungarians, we're still discriminated because in Hungarian it's still like this. If you put it in Hungarian, it's still only he's a doctor. Now, where does this AI bias come from? The algorithms in machine learning itself, you all know they are agnostic. They don't introduce bias. If there's bias, the bias comes from the data. Let's look at an example from healthcare. This was a paper from a startup in Toronto, and they could show that actually they could predict the onset of Alzheimer's with a relatively high accuracy just by recording a person's speech. This was very nice. There's just one little problem, at least the first version. This was the only place in the world where this tool could be used. And why? Because they trained this model exclusively on people from Toronto. So the only speech pattern that this tool actually could understand was the English dialect of Toronto. And this is very prominent in healthcare, and I just want to show this. This is an overview of genomic studies until 2009 and 2016. And as you can see, the overwhelming majority of these studies were done on people of European descent. So if you develop any predictive tool on genomic data, on this data, it will only be applicable to people of European descent and will have a huge bias if applied to other people. One of the most problematic biases that can creep into our systems is actually cognitive bias. So what does that mean? Let's do a thought experiment. We are now a tech giant. It's a fictive tech giant. And we realize one thing. We realize we actually pay a lot of money for recruiting people, right? You probably all know that. Online interviews, on-site interviews, people are flown through the world for on-sites. This costs a lot of money. We could save a lot of money if we, train a model that can take a CV and then just say, this is a good candidate or this is a bad candidate. We could save a lot of money. So why don't we do that? Because we're a tech giant and we actually have our company data, right? We have all the data from the last, I don't know how many years of our hiring, and we assume we're great at hiring. So let's take that data. So could there be bias in it? Let's have a look. Could there be gender bias in it? Probably yes. Which gender biases do we know that affect hiring? Affinity bias. It's a cognitive bias. We tend to like people who are similar to us. So if you have a workforce where there are mostly males, then there is already a cognitive bias that you don't want to change that structure. Intergroup bias. It's also called a cultural fit bias. It's like people from the same, university, from the same background like each other. And there is a certain, as probably all know, male geek culture that sometimes is prevalent in this field, which is not so easy then for others to fit in. Confirmation bias is a cognitive bias, which is a problem here. If you already believe that it's better to hire certain people, in this case males, then if a female does something wrong, you will say, yeah, of course, we shouldn't have hired her. If a male does something wrong, yeah, he basically just had a bad day. So we just confirm what we already believe. There's the horn effect, which really means like having horns like the devil. So this means that we see something physically on a person, some feature, and believe that this person must be, for example, bad at this job. One example is here obesity. It's shown that obese people are thought to actually be worse at their jobs, and it's also shown scientifically that this disproportionately affects women. And basically, almost as an overview of this, there's gender stereotyping, meaning that, as we saw in the example that I saw, if it's a doctor, it must be male. If it's a nurse, she must be female. And if we talk about a programmer must be male, right? No, of course not. But this is exactly the cognitive bias. So, taking all this together, would our tool work? Well, this wasn't a thought experiment. Some of you might have read about this. It was reported that Amazon just recently had to actually kill a tool where they tried to, because they couldn't get the bias out of their own hiring data. They used their own hiring data to build such a tool. And they couldn't get the bias against women out of the tool. Of course, they didn't put in gender, but even something, the moment the tool was so tuned discriminating against women, the moment it found that somebody attended a female university, that person was out. So they actually pulled the plug, which is good. Other companies won't. And already in 2016, it was reported that 72% of resumes, at least in the US, were weeded out before a human ever saw them. And this is not only a problem, this was now gender bias, but we can assume that hiring in the past data, there was discrimination not only against women, there might have been discrimination against poor people, against migrants, and so forth and so forth. Another problem, unregulated AI. Development in AI, and you know how fast it is basically faster than legislation. This is what I strongly believe. And politics, as you all know, lack the knowledge. They have no idea about artificial intelligence. And our democratic processes are likely too slow to keep up with this. So this will be a huge challenge. We will be confronted a lot with systems that don't match any regulation, which are not regulated. So this will be a huge ethical challenge in the future. How do we deal with this? There's also the problem of ethics shopping. If AI is a market driver, there will be different levels of regulation throughout the world. So it is very likely that companies, but also governments, others will try to do shopping. So they will go where they get what they want, and they might get a tool from somewhere where the ethical standards are much lower than where the ones we have. How do we deal with this? Are we still using it, knowing that this might have been, developed, let's say, in China? What is not talked so much about, which I believe is a very, very big ethical challenge, is AI manipulation. As probably many of you know, these systems don't exactly work like basically our brains work. It's very easy to take the image of a cat, just change a few pixels, and then suddenly the output of your model is toaster and not cat anymore. Although to us, the image still looks like a cat. And it's very easy to assume that bomb scanning systems could be fooled, insurance fraud could be committed, and actually already has been shown that just very, very subtle manipulations of a street sign make the street sign actually invisible for an autonomously driving car. So, of course, we need robustness against this kind of manipulation, otherwise we have a huge ethical challenge. We just pretended to be a tech giant, but as you all know, many of the powerful AI tools are actually in the hands of the real existing tech giants. And how do we make sure that actually what they develop is responsible? We had in Berlin in June an event together with Google, where the head of the responsible development team of Google presented what they do internally. And to be honest, that was really good. The problem here is, what if the next CEO of Google, 5 years, 10 years, just decides we don't need that anymore? We don't need responsible development. So it cannot be that responsible development is dependent on the whims of the CEO or of a new CEO. So taken together, we have big challenges regarding these ethical challenges, which are, some of them are technical. We're going to talk later a bit about it, what we can do from the technical side. But of course, there is also big from society side. And why is that? Because if we take this now together, we're basically right now at the crossroads regarding this technology. If we develop tools on unbiased data, the overall bias in our societies will go down. Why is that? Because a person who is potentially biased will use an unbiased tool. So we have actually the possibility to decrease bias in many places. Imagine an unbiased recruiting tool. Suddenly, more people would be hired and a more diverse hiring would happen. If we do it wrong, however, and we just take all our biases and automatize them, basically, and put them in tools, then we will increase bias because even the unbiased person will now actually use a biased tool. So we will have more bias in our societies. And this is really the crossroads where we're at the moment. And one of the things that we really need here, I strongly believe, is a public discussion. We need more public AI literacy, we need public discussions, and this also especially means that experts, most of you are experts regarding this technology, also should really first be aware of the ethical implications and also go out and talk to others. And this is very, very important because I mentioned governments regarding regulation, but governments, the moment they will understand this technology better, and some governments already understood it, There is a threat that if the public doesn't understand how these things work, there might be a threat even to the fabric, to the main fabric of our societies, to democracy itself. Okay, let's take a deep breath now. The world is not going to end, although it sounded a bit like it. So let's look at solutions. The solutions now are tied to also to the title of the talk, to the subtitle, what developers should know. What are potential solutions that we can actually use here? It's very, very important to get away from what I like to call the Kaggle mentality. There's a data set. So somebody prepared this data set. Now I start with the fun part, with the predictive modeling. It's definitely the fun part, right? I mean, maybe some of you are passionate data wranglers. Some people are. But in the end, we have to have a culture where we say, data needs always to be questioned. What is the source? Is there bias in the data? And one really important thing here is also you need a workforce that is more diverse, that could be then more aware of these biases. If you think back to this tool of Google, where suddenly black people were labeled as gorillas, it's probably likely that in a more diverse workforce, somebody would have realized, hey, we have only, just a few labels for black people. There might be a problem. It will probably not work well. It must be in the training, so AI engineers should really be trained in understanding source of bias, but also in the ethical implications. If I ask around now, people who did a master's in AI universities, they said we never talked about this at all. It was only focused really on. Only the technical parts. Ethical implications and bias implications were not even mentioned. I think this should really change. And there are, when I said data, of course it could be in data source, but if we actually think this through, of course, any step in the data preparation or in the data analysis process can introduce bias. It can be in the data already. It can be introduced in the data wrangling process. It can be introduced in a sub-selection of the data, and data labeling is a big problem. So all these steps actually can lead in itself to bias, and during the development process, engineers need to be aware of it. There is the possibility to debias data. So as you probably know, there are many also companies who work actually on toolboxes that can help you to actually debias your data. There should be guidelines for companies. I mentioned Google, the responsible innovation team. So you should have, so companies that develop AI, they should have internal responsible development guidelines. This should be something that a company has. There's also the problem, we talked about development, but there's of course also research. We need reporting guidelines. I'm not sure how many of you are aware that in AI research we have abysmally bad scientific quality. How often have you read maybe a paper and you realize the information there is not even remotely enough for me to reproduce this? But the hallmark of science is reproducibility. You need to be able to do exactly what the person did. It should be a cookbook. Now, like with any recipe, you might have to try once or twice, but in the end, you should be able to replicate this. If you can't replicate this, it's bad science. It's very simple. And part of it is having reporting guidelines. There are other fields that clearly say, okay, what needs to be reported so that I can understand this and I can reproduce this? We don't have it. There was recently, I saw that somebody in an archive, there was a paper that suggested model cards. And that is actually a really nice thing. I really liked it, where you basically in every publication should have a model card, which is a reporting guideline, which says these are the things you should report about your model. We should adapt that, right? So in the medical field, this was understood There are now reporting guidelines at least suggested for clinical trials that use artificial intelligence, but of course this is not exactly the same. So we need, and this must be a community effort, because only the experts can decide what needs to be inside these reporting guidelines. Now, of course, we need ethical frameworks that are especially tailored to this, that there are not really ones that people have agreed on. And we need regulation, so both the FDA but also European Union have started to work on such guidelines. So the European Union just published recently the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. So this is something that is publicly available that maybe you also should read, or it would be a nice read. But again, these have not found their way yet into any type of regulation. And interestingly, that means that a field like healthcare, where I come from, is the field where I'm least concerned, because we already have regulation. If you want to build a medical product built on machine learning, it's a medical product, it's a medical device. You have to go through medical device regulation. And yes, the regulators at the moment have no idea about this technology, but they will have to, because they will be confronted with it. And for example, the so-called notified bodies, which do these check of the systems, they work closely. So in Germany, they work closely with an institute that is that knows a lot about medical devices. They, for example, know a lot about AI. They will probably adapt very soon the guidelines from this institute. And those guidelines are pretty heavy, and they really know what AI is about. So there's not a problem. But what about the fields where there is no regulation? You're probably aware that in the US already, they use artificial intelligence systems. Judges use artificial intelligence systems to determine how big the likelihood is that somebody will commit a crime in the future. And by the way, these systems are completely biased. In this area, we have no regulation. And there are many other areas where we have no regulation. So we need this regulation in these areas. At least I'm convinced about it. Now, what is this? I come to this point, and this I would like to explain. So we talked about morality and ethics. Now there's a different word, which is called the ethos. Now, what is an ethos? The ethos is basically the morality of a group. As you probably know, physicians, medicine was my first study, physicians have an ethos. There are certain things which a doctor shouldn't do, and they are not forbidden by law. It's just things that a physician shouldn't do. It's codified by the morality of doctors. So if a physician is basically violating this ethos, the physicians themselves, the Chamber of Physicians, can revoke their license. So that person will not be able to legally practice medicine anymore. They might not have to basically break a law for this, but there is an ethos that doctors don't do certain things. So this is the morality of a profession. And I strongly believe, or I suggest it, maybe especially a crowd, and this could be also something we can discuss, that maybe there should exist something like a developer's ethos. Something that you, as a community of developers, basically a codified morals that you decide, you say, the moment we develop certain systems, there are things we should do and there are things we just won't do. There are certain tools which should not be developed. And now, right now, it's easy to say, but that was my job. I was paid for it, I got the data, I did it. What's happening with it, it's not my problem. I think that is too easy. If these systems actually have such a big impact of society, you have reached the level of doctors, because your actions actually have a big impact on the lives of people. So maybe you should have such an ethos yourself, and you should have a chamber of AI developers that is actually checking this and realizing what is moral, so to say, AI coding. And with this thought, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay, do you have a question to Vince? We have spot for one question. No questions?
I'm around today, so you can always approach me and ask questions. Thanks a lot.
Oh, there's one question on the back.
Then
Good. First question of the conference. Takes time.
yes.
Great presentation, thank you. I'd like to ask one question. You mentioned that the governments and regulation are not following the speed of development of AI. Isn't that our responsibility to explain to the people who don't understand what it is? I mean, I think this is more like we should be like we know more, so we should explain. We should put a lot of effort into explaining to the government what it is all about, and not complaining about that. Isn't that how it should be?
Absolutely. I think I mentioned when I said public AI literacy that I really think those who know, I would almost say, have a more responsibility to teach others. Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Okay, there was one here as well. No? All right. Thank you so much, Vince.
Thanks a lot.
Big applause. Yes, Romeo. Ah, you have a question, sorry.
I'm Samuel Greek with Nielsen, and my question is, do you think that if we don't come up with our own ethos,
Sorry, can you put the mic a bit closer?
do you think that if we don't come up with our own ethos, that potentially governments or other bodies will come up with the ethos for us? And do you think that we're more capable of coming up with a better ethos than those government bodies?
So I would answer it like this. There will be regulation, I'm pretty sure about this. So it's the same as in the medical field. There's regulation, which means there are laws. And basically the ethos will sometimes overlap with the law, but there will be, again, parts which go beyond the laws. So I think this is where the place of an ethos is. Of course, you will be able to somehow influence regulation, because at least I hope politics will ask the people that are actually involved in this. But I think there really needs to be this ethos as well, because otherwise, I really think that there was a reason why fields, like lawyers, like physicians, started having this, because the impact was so strong. So I really think that this especially, so where the law ends, the ethos should start. This is kind of what I mean.
But didn't the ethos in those industries come before the laws did? They knew how to organize themselves before, for example, the governments knew how to organize them. So they made their effort to regulate themselves, as far as I understand it, before the governments came in and mandated things that didn't make sense for them, because the governments just don't have that level of knowledge, like for AI.
Absolutely, it could be that way. If you start early enough, then a lot of this will actually become a law that also makes sense from your side, from the developer's side, and then there will be less iterations over, wait, that went too far, this didn't make sense. So I agree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.